let's start thinking about repairing systems and not just putting a Band-Aid on it. You have diabetes, drug number 1, then you escalate to drug number 2, then you get cardiovascular disease, you have 2 more drugs there, right? So everybody is going along with the system and nobody wants to change it. We know that nutrition can revolutionize almost everything in medicine. It's not going to cure everybody, but it can certainly make an incredible difference, more than we've ever seen.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. Today, we're going to talk about the science of fasting, the science of nutrition, longevity, and disease prevention with Dr. Valter Longo, one of the world's leading researchers in this field, returning for his second appearance on the show. Named one of the 50 most influential people in healthcare by Time magazine in 2018, Dr. Longo is a professor of gerontology and biological sciences at the University of Southern California. He's also the director of the Longevity Institute at USC, as well as the director of the Longevity and Cancer Program at the IFOM Institute in Milan, Italy. In addition, Valter is the author of the international bestseller, The Longevity Diet, all profits of which he donates to research and to his foundation. And he's the creator of something called the Fasting Mimicking Diet. Today, we pick up where we left off 4 years ago, episode 367, if you missed it, covering the latest research on fasting and the 5 nutrition pillars of longevity. We discuss various fasting strategies, the acute versus chronic effects of food on metabolism. We talk about optimal protein intake based on age, high-fat versus low-fat diets, how to think about and contextualize other protocols emerging from health span science and technology, and many other topics. I love geeking out with Valter. He really is one of the world's brightest minds on the cutting edge of longevity science. And this one is full of prescriptive advice, including how to separate what we know from overblown hype. So, if this channel is providing you value at all I ask in return is that you take a moment to click that subscribe button. Thank you very much. And with that, I give you Dr. Valter Longo. Valter, it's great to see you. It was awesome to reconnect with you in Miami recently. I'm glad that I did not give you COVID that experience.
Me too.
It's been 4 years since we did this, and after seeing you, I thought it would be great to have you back on. And there's so many things I think that we could talk about. There's been a lot of research in science since 4 years ago, but I thought a good place, an interesting place to start, would be with this recent study that just came out. This study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, a study coming out of China, that showed that intermittent fasting had no impact versus regular feeding windows in terms of weight loss. Now, I know your expertise is in longevity and not weight loss, but because this study was sort of widely covered in the media and caused a little bit of a kerfuffle amongst fasting enthusiasts in the kind of wellness world in general, I assume you're familiar with this study, and I thought it would be wise to kind of solicit your thoughts on it.
Yes. So my understanding of the study was that they looked at long-term calorie restriction plus or minus time-restricted eating. Mm-hmm. So either you're calorie restricted severely, and then you eat within a window of 8 hours, I believe.
Yeah.
Or you just calorie restricted. So first of all, it's really a pointless study because these long-term calorie restriction studies, we already know that they're going to result in people regaining the weight back. They're too excessive. And also, most people don't realize that they're probably associated with this thrifty mode, meaning that the body eventually slows down metabolism. We know this from multiple calorie restriction studies. And so now you're stuck, and there was an old New England Journal of Medicine study showing that. So now you lose weight, but now your metabolism adjusts even lower than your adjustment per kilogram of body weight. So that means that you're pretty much condemned to regaining all the weight. Right? So it's a pointless study to begin with. And then in addition to that, you add the time-restricted eating. I don't think it's a valid argument. I'm not a big fan of 16 hours a day. I'm a big fan of 12 hours of fasting a day. But I don't think it should be used against the 16 hours because it was just, a study that shouldn't have, I don't think it should be done not that way. And it doesn't really lead to any conclusions.
Right. I mean, what was interesting about it, first of all, it was conducted over a period of a year. So at least according to the media, that was the longest term under which they had studied humans with some kind of setup like this. But the feeding window was 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., which I guess, it's sort of like eating an early dinner. It's not that different than a normal feeding window.
Yes, but again, you're associating it with severe calorie restriction, right?
Right. So, it was like 1,500 calories, 15 to 1,800 or something like that.
For males, is severe calorie restriction, even worse than what Walford and other people did in the past, right? So these are already starting with something that is so extreme that, and at the end of the study, you can see that what we know happens in most cases, they start regaining weight, right? So, starting in the 8 or 9 months, you start seeing the weight regain, which is, again, what's been observed in so many studies.
Right. They also identified no substantive difference in risk factors, which of course is related to longevity. But in your mind, is that a function of the calorie restriction, or why was that part of the results as well?
Well, if you go from 3,000 calories, 2,500, 3,000 calories a day to 1,500 or whatever, it's not surprising that an addition, compacting it into 8 hours versus however many hours, it makes no difference.
Right.
So I don't think that says anything about fasting in general. Fasting, first of all, is not 16 hours every day. Fasting is a lot of different techniques. Some that work and some that don't. And that one, happened to, I think it told us that if you're already severely restricted, eating within 8 hours doesn't help you any further.
Right. So we're going to define these different fasting modalities, what works, what doesn't, in your opinion, and how we're thinking about longevity. But before we do that, if you were to construct a proper study, what parameters would you set up? Like, what did they get wrong, and how could somebody do this where it would show, a legitimate, effective result that would be reliable?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you don't want to do severe interventions like that, right? Because people will abandon it. And then when they abandon it for a few times, it's worse than when you never started, right? So it's better to let somebody be overweight and even obese than take them through these yo-yo cycles of losing a lot of weight, regaining a lot of weight, right? So we know that from studies, previous studies. So you want to, as we do in I have two foundation clinics, right? And we try to minimize the changes and try to be as effective as possible with minimal changes. And you want to probably take a couple of years to get there. So we have diabetes patients and people with cardiovascular disease. It takes a couple of years to convert somebody back, really convert them into something that they can sustain for the rest of their lives, right? So you want to intervene, for example, the longevity diet, which I just published an article, describing why the longevity diet should be adopted. It's a high carbohydrate, but not high refined carbohydrate, and not a low sugar, low refined carbohydrate, high carbohydrate, composed of lots of legumes, lots of whole grains, nuts, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the type of diet. Of course, each person is going to have a different version of it, right? So this is not meant to be. So if you're gluten sensitive, you're probably not going to have a whole grain, high carbohydrate diet. But you can pick a different type of high carbohydrate diet. So by just the protein restriction, we now know to be regulating weight, right? So the people, most people, lots of people eat a lot of proteins to lose weight. And it turns out that looks, based on our research and the research of many others, to be the opposite, right? The protein restriction is leading the system to go into a fat catabolism, a fat burning mode. So this is just one trick. Another trick is eat a lot, right? So if you eat legumes, it might take a pound of legumes to get 45 grams of proteins. If you eat, a steak, it takes 200 grams, right? So a lot less, right? So I think there's lots of tricks to get somebody to, in short term, lose weight, particularly abdominal fat, without losing a lean body mass. We just finished a study where we're looking at Mediterranean diet, and after 4 months of the Mediterranean diet, patients lost 3 pounds of muscle mass, and after 7 months, 3 pounds, and after 7 months, 5 pounds of lean body mass. So I think that there is a whole system to be adapted. And as you know, I believe in these periodic fasting mimicking diets that can get you to slowly lose weight without losing lean body mass. And again, in a couple of years, by a combination of the everyday longevity diet, which I just described, and the fasting mimicking diet, I think that most people that adhere to it are going to mostly lose fat, but also undergo some type of reset. Going after insulin resistance, going after maybe some inflammatory issues, certainly some cholesterol, high cholesterol, et cetera.
So you mentioned this article that recently came out. I assume you're talking about the article in Cell that you co-authored with Rosalind Anderson?
Yes.
Yeah. So explain that. I thought that was really interesting. It basically establishes the parameters for this longevity diet and why it's so effective. So maybe explain what the longevity diet is and what this article kind of explored in terms of the link between nutrients, fasting, genes, and longevity, et cetera.
Yes. So the longevity diet tries to move away from opinion and move into a multi-pillar system,
How
right?
dare you?
We're exactly. For sure, the epidemiological studies, lots of epidemiological studies, so studies of big populations, but then the clinical studies, the centenarian studies, and lots of focus, at least in that paper that you just mentioned, on model systems, right? So what happens in mice, and what are the genes that control aging, and what are the nutrients that control the gene that control the aging process, right? So that on one side you have the obesity and all the problems that come with it. On the other side, you have the acceleration of the aging process itself. And we know, we always think about smoking and obesity as major risk factor for diseases, but when you compare them to aging, they disappear as risk factors, right? So targeting aging is the most important thing, even more than obesity, way more than obesity, right?
Wow.
So if you can slow down just a little bit the aging process, you can do much more than obesity does. Of course, obesity and smoking are a big second and third, but they are dwarfed compared to the aging process.
Right. So you began your career looking at yeast, aging in yeast, to try to identify what these mechanisms are. Maybe explain how this is applicable to human health and what exactly, like how we should think about what that aging mechanism or process is.
Yes. So actually, I started with Roy Walford working on humans and mice, and I understood that it wasn't going anywhere. So I went back to yeast from humans and mice, right? So which at the time, people thought it was just a bad idea.
Right.
And so I think that if you look at the genes that regulate aging in many organisms, and we think humans, so because now we've been following people with a certain mutation, which I'll talk about in a second, the growth pathways seem to be at the center of the aging process. So if you take a yeast, a fly, a mouse, and now we'll talk about humans, they live a lot longer if you block IGF-1, insulin, and other growth factors. And not only they become a lot longer lived, so in yeast, for example, by blocking this protein pathway, and then on the other side, blocking the sugar pathway, and then starving them, they live 10 times longer, right? So you completely reprogram their ability, their lifespan. And this is compressed as you move up. So in mice, they live about 40 to 50% longer if they have deficiency in these growth genes, particularly the growth hormone gene and the growth hormone receptor gene. And so when we then study humans, those deficient in the same gene, growth hormone receptor, we haven't proven yet longevity extension, but they're protected from cancer, they're protected from cognitive decline, they're protected from diabetes. So they seem to be protected from most of the human chronic age-related disorders, right? So we suspect that we're also going to see lifespan extension. We're not going to see 50% like in mice, but even if we saw 10%, 15% with very little chronic diseases, that would be, I think, remarkable.
How do we understand the nature of that compression as we go from yeast all the way up to humans, and why it doesn't scale in a more linear fashion?
Probably because of evolutionary theories, meaning that every organism is evolved by being able to have different modality, right? So for example, yeast, you can have a modality, so life in the fast lane, and they live about 2 or 3 days. Then you can starve them a little bit, or starve them, and they live about 2 weeks. And then you have something called the spore state. And in the spore state, they live 100 times longer than in the fast lane, right? So they live years. So that tells you that probably in every organism there are, there's like a reproductive grow mode. And then there is a maintenance mode where the decision is made that there's probably not enough food, not enough to grow, not enough to reproduce. So I'm just going to stand by and try to protect myself as best as I can. So now, of course, most of us are not reproducing most of the time. So probably a good idea, right, to switch to that modality and stay there until we are ready to reproduce. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So then with respect to humans, you've identified these 5 pillars of longevity. So maybe we can walk through them and then drill down more specifically on the diet piece.
Yes. So in this study you just mentioned, epidemiology, of course, is very central. So lots of studies, epidemiological studies, looking at what people that live long eat, right? And so one thing we published on a few years ago was, if you look at Americans, those that have a high protein diet, they do very poorly compared to those that have a very low protein diet. But that's only true up to age 65. And then after 65, it turns around a little bit, and those that have a moderate protein intake do better than those that have a low protein intake. And so I think if you look at the data and if you look at the Harvard studies, they're supportive of this, right? So they will say that a low carbohydrate diet is bad for you in general, unless it's a plant-based low carbohydrate diet. They haven't looked so much at the age dependent effect, but I think we are in agreement that low carbohydrate diet and high protein are not good for you. It should be the other way around, low protein, high carbohydrate. And so epidemiological studies are, I think, generally consistent with this notion. So for example, there's another Lancet meta-analysis looking at carbohydrate intake, and it's better for lifespan to be an 80% carbohydrate diet than to be in a low carbohydrate diet. And if you go to a very low carbohydrate diet, let's say 20%, there's a 60% increased risk of mortality compared to the 50, 60% of the calories coming from carbohydrate. But then what happens is that people confuse this with excess carbohydrate. Right? They think that when I say high carbohydrate diet, I mean excess carbohydrate. So we had doctors, for example, complain and say, well, now we're in the United States, 70% of people are overweight and obese, and you're talking about high carbohydrate diet. But in fact, I'm talking about proportions, right? So you got to get food from somewhere. Of course, you have to have the right amount of calories. You cannot have excess, but the about 50 to 60% should probably come from carbohydrate. So epidemiology shows that. And then just to give you an example, right? If you think about carbohydrate, if you look even in a yeast or a mouse, if you feed them a lot of sugar, in most of the cases, you're going to accelerate some of the aging pathways on the sugar side, and then even more clearly on the protein side, but especially on the certain amino acids, like methionine seems to be at the very center of the acceleration of the aging process. And so, and this is pillar 2, right? So basic research. And then clinical studies, I think, are pillar 3. They're very supportive of all of this. And so, for example, in the longevity diet, we talk about certain fats, yes, but certain type of fats. And if you look at, for example, the work by Astruc in Spain, thousands of people randomized, one group at risk for cardiovascular disease, one group placed on a low-fat diet, and one group placed on lots of olive oil or lots of nuts. Right?
There was a study that came out like just last week about that, I think.
There's been many studies that followed up. I didn't see maybe there was one last week. I didn't see that one. But now it's pretty consistent and showing that, the high olive oil, high nut diet is better for people.
Which is so interesting and somewhat counterintuitive with respect to cardiovascular disease.
Yes, historically, and to this day, lots of prominent experts will say, go to a no-fat diet, no matter what it is, right? So, sure, it seems to be true. It's better to not have saturated fats, animal fats. And again, the epidemiology agrees with that. But when we're talking about these monounsaturated fats, olive oil, nuts, probably certain fish like salmon, that seems to be consistently associated with living longer. And then, the centenarian studies, of course, one of the most important pillars. So if a low carbohydrate diet is not so good for you, let's look around. Let's look at Okinawans. Let's look at people in Sardinia, in Calabria, in Loma Linda, in Costa Rica, in Greece. Do they have a low carbohydrate diet? Or do they have, as we will expect, a high carbohydrate diet? And all of them, high to very high carbohydrate diet, including the Okinawans, who used to get about 70% of the calories from sweet potatoes, as you heard at the conference from Dan Buettner.
Right. So with all of that, and of course, it's about, when you're talking about a high carbohydrate diet, you're talking about, you have to drill down on what that means specifically. It's not eating pretzels and tons of, refined carbohydrates. These are like whole plant foods for the most part.
Yes. I mean, it can also be whole grains, right? So whole grains in this study done by this meta-analysis that came out a couple of months ago, but this Norwegian group, the number one source of food associated with life expectancy increase was legumes. And number two was whole grain cereals, right? It's not just, let's say vegetables, but it's also lots of, carbohydrate that may not necessarily be associated with health, right? For example, say whole grain pasta, but even pasta, it's probably okay, right? If you don't, certainly it was okay for most of the centenarians in most areas. And so, for example, for the Okinawans, the sweet potato, right? You wouldn't necessarily think the sweet potato is that good for you, but it was very good for them. And so I think you cannot for sure have lots of bread and lots of potatoes and lots of pasta, but a certain amount of it is probably not bad. And don't forget that our body is not fueled by complex carbohydrates. Eventually is fueled by sugar, right? So eventually it gets turned into pure sugar. And that's what the brain and every other cell wants, unless you have ketone bodies or fatty acids around, right? So yeah, sometimes we forget the basic biochemistry, but we are fueled by sugar.
So with this understanding, the kind of basic tenets of what comprises a diet that promotes longevity based on this research, where does fasting come in? Like, what is the relationship between these dietary pillars and these protocols around fasting or fasting mimicking?
So I think there are two. I always look first at the safety factor, right? So what is it that we don't know if it's safe or not? And then I just exclude them until we have many decades, I think, of evidence. But if you look at safety and efficacy both, I think you come up with 12 hours every day as being very solid. I always say I've never seen a study showing that if you do 12 hours of fasting a day, you're going to have a problem. When you get to 16, and as I think already discussed before, you get to 16 hours, you get to breakfast skipping, and you see meta-analysis, not just studies, but studies of all studies showing increased mortality, reduced lifespan. Now, what is the reason for it? We don't know. Probably there are double-edged swords, right? So, for example, ketone bodies, maybe fatty acids, ketone bodies are going both ways, right? They're helping you on one side and they're hurting you on the other side. But so 12 hours, very solid, right? And the work by Sachin Panda and everything else is supportive of it. And then I would say probably people, we eat all the time. And so thousands of years ago, but as humans evolved, we evolved probably insulin resistance as a way to survive the winters, right? So you eat as much as you can during the summer or whenever food is available. You become diabetic, essentially, pre-diabetic or diabetic. You put everything away, and then the winter comes or some period where there is no food, and then you become insulin sensitive again. So I think what happens now is everybody is insulin resistant all the time, or somewhat insulin resistant all the time because the winter never comes. And that's where this prolonged, not just 16 hours of fasting, but say 5 days, that's what we've been working on. That's where they come in. There seems to be pretty clear. Now we have 3 more clinical trials that we are about to publish. Very clear that they switch you into an insulin sensitive mode. So, and also they switch you into a long-term anti-aging mode. So for example, leptin, and now this is about 4 clinical trials that we've done. Leptin stays low for a long time after you return to normal diet. IGF-1, the central growth factor pro-aging, it stays down for months. So in the first trial, we showed that after 3 months from the end, IGF-1 was still lowered. So then I think that there is, on one side, insulin sensitization. So the system now goes into a fat utilization mode versus building. And the system also goes into a maintenance mode. So now I'm just going to protect myself as much as possible, age as slowly as possible, waiting for the next wave of lots of food where maybe I can focus on reproducing.
Right. So with this understanding that there is no winter, the winter is not coming, and everybody's kind of hurtling towards some degree of, being pre-diabetic because of the Western way of eating, how malleable is that? Like, if somebody has been in that pre-diabetic state or in a situation where they lack insulin sensitivity for a prolonged period of time, what is your sense of how one can repair that? Like, if you've just arrived in that situation, it's probably going to be easier for you through fasting and these other protocols to bounce back and create some insulin sensitivity. But if you've been in that state for a decade, does it become more difficult, or can you still repair it?
You can still repair it. We just finished a trial on diabetes in Holland, 100 patients. And I cannot tell you the results, but I can tell you that even if you're diabetic, you're obese, you've been taking medicine for years and years and years, no problem. We can bring it back. We cannot bring it back in everybody, but I would say the great majority of people, you have the team, the physician, the dietitian, and you have to have the method. So, and in that trial, it was just fasting mimicking diet, no longevity diet.
Yeah.
In the clinic, we do both, right? But again, we don't push you to 1,500 calories if you had 2,500 calories. We push you to keep the calories maybe just a little bit lower. You maybe go from 2,500 to 2,300. And then we work on the what I call Nutri-technology. We work on making it easier for you to lose weight rather than starving you for a year, hoping that you stay like that for the rest of your life, which you're never going to do.
So in the 4 years since we sat down, there's been quite an explosion of interest in fasting. It's gone from this, kind of curious, endeavor into something that has truly gotten mainstream attention. A lot of discussion about different ways of fasting and many different, as you mentioned, different types of thinking about fasting: intermittent fasting, alternate day fasting, time-restricted eating, fasting mimicking. Maybe it would be worth kind of just talking about fasting in general and the validity of these various protocols and why you feel so strongly that the fasting mimicking approach is optimal.
Yes. So alternate day fasting, it's an extension of the 16 hours, let's say, right? So there's no doubt that if you do 16 hours of fasting every day, or you don't eat every other day, you're going to get a lot of metabolic effects. The problem and the question is, now that we have meta-analysis showing that if you skip breakfast, you live shorter, and you have more cardiovascular disease and probably more cancer, et cetera, is there some issue with these ketone bodies, with these fatty acids, et cetera, et cetera? So no arguing with the metabolic effects short term, but a big problem with long term, right? So I would say, don't do it, right? Certainly don't skip breakfast. Now, what we're starting a trial is now what happens potentially if you skip lunch. So you keep the 12 hours and then skip lunch. That's what I've been doing for 20 years. But now we're going to finally get to test it. We don't know, but let's see. And so that's alternate day fasting, or let's say 16-8. Then you have, let's say 5-2, right? That's another popular one. Well, what happens if you do 2 days a week of fasting or semi-fasting? Well, we don't know, right? Because there's not very many studies. There's a few. It looks promising. The problem I see with that is most people have a difficult time, I say, going from 4 coffees a day or 3 coffees a day to 2 coffees a day. Half of the people that used to smoke are still smoking, even though we know that it kills you, and it says that on the package. So is that going to really be more than a small percentage of the population? So even if we show that was effective, who's going to do that, right? I mean, I don't know. Personally, I don't know anybody that would go 2 days a week without, eating anything, right? I don't know a single person. But that doesn't mean it could not be effective, and that doesn't mean there are not people that could do it long term. So I'm not arguing that, with the effectiveness, and I'm not arguing that some people could do it. I will say the great majority of people are not going to do it. And then I will say we even don't know what will happen long term, right? So we got to go with things that are more realistic, less invasive. And that's where the fasting mimicking diet comes in. And this is, again, 30 years of work since the Walford years, right? So it's not an idea that I say, I see a few patients in my clinic, they're doing so well with these 5 days, I'm just going to do that, as it happened for many very popular diets in the past. So this was 30 years of building from all these pillars, right? And then you get to a point where you say, this looks very promising. Like, what if we made people do this 3 times a year for 5 days, 4 times maybe? And if you have diabetes, in the diabetes trial, we did 1 cycle a month for 12 months. But most people did not do 12 cycles. Some people did 2, some people did 6, some people did 8, and some people did 12. So now we're going to analyze the data, and we'll be able to tell, who is doing well. But overall, they all did well. So I think that the 2 to 4 times a year, let's say, some people may even less. Somebody like you, probably, a couple times a year, it'd be more than sufficient. But for most people, let's say 3 to 4 times a year, that seems to be very realistic. It's clearly showing this long-term efficacy. It doesn't. It allows for FDA-like. It doesn't have to be FDA, but FDA-like procedures where you can say, "Hey, this was tested. That's exactly the way you should test it, and everybody can test it. Everybody can grab it." So now we have 30 clinical trials running. Some of them, we help them with. Some of them, people just get it and they do their own trial. So that's the way it should be. Allow everybody to test it, and let's see, right? Eventually, we're going to see these are millions of people, and we're going to see the reports from it. And I really think that that's slowly moving in the toolkit of physicians on one side for lots of diseases, but it's also moving in the toolkit of the people that are paying attention and that want something that is being clinically tested.
And just because we haven't defined it, essentially what you're saying is this is a 5-day protocol where we provide you through Prolon this meal delivery, meal kit situation. And when you eat this way, you're mimicking your biological response to fasting without being overly calorically deprived.
Yeah, I cannot talk about products, because I'm prohibited from doing it. So in the FMD, for example, for cancer, it's 4 days. It's very different from the one for normal people, which is 5 days, as you just mentioned. Then we have one for autoimmunities, is 7 days. We have one for Alzheimer we're testing now in Italy, which is 5 days, but then it has a daily supplement for the in-between. So it's really about nutri-technology. But yes, the fasting mimicking diet, let's say, goes from 4 to 7 days in most cases, plus or minus what could be supplements. For example, in the Alzheimer, we were worried about people losing weight, and some people did lose weight. And so that's why we give them a supplement between the 25 days between one cycle and the next of the fasting mimicking diet. We also, because they're so old, let's say 75, 80, 85 years old, we give them a higher calorie fasting mimicking diet, right? So yeah, so we adjust based on the age, on the disease, and eventually, I think there might be adjustments also.
Right.
For example, now we're developing a non-inflammatory one. Lots of people with inflammatory bowel disease, colitis, gastrointestinal problems. We're developing something that is non-allergenic, non-inflammatory, which I think it's going to be very important for. And I mean the university. I don't mean I'm not talking about company. So yeah, I think that's certainly. I'll be very surprised if this doesn't move into more of a mainstream and start competing with the drugs, right? I mean that's what we're trying to say. Like, let's start thinking about repairing systems, based on all the things that we discussed, and not just putting a Band-Aid on it. You have diabetes, drug number 1, then you escalate to drug number 2, then you get cardiovascular disease, you have 2 more drugs there. And this is what happens. It's really criminal, I think, in the United States, in Europe, all over the world, as, I call it unconspired conspiracy, right? So everybody is going along with this system, and you have a lot of bad food, and a lot of drugs that people take, and the whole system is profiting from it. But people, the average 45-year-old now has got 2 chronic conditions in the United States, and so by the time you get to 55, 60, you probably have about 3 chronic conditions, taking lots of drugs, right? So we're saying, what is the system? Not to just block that, but to bring you back to a healthy status. And, it used to be ideas. Now we see it in the clinical trials, but we also see it in the foundation clinics where we follow lots of people. So we're very confident that this can work, but it's not going to work unless you have, the team that I was discussing earlier, the doctor, the dietitian, and the knowledge, and probably also the molecular biologists, right? So when you get to complex, so we get people at the clinic all the time, and they have very complicated problems, right? And so you have a very busy physician, even our own, right? And you have a very busy dietitian. And I think that the molecular biologist specialized in whatever field, it could be the key person, right? So the strategist, like I am, right? So this person comes in, works with the physician and works with the dietitian to strategize. How do I solve the problem? This person got 3 chronic conditions. Where do they come from? And how do I solve them without creating another problem, right? That's got to be at the very center of everything, and it's not.
Sorry to interrupt the flow. We'll be right back with more awesome, but I want to snag a moment to talk to you about the importance of nutrition. The thing is, most people I know actually already know how to eat better and aspire to incorporate more whole plants, more fruits, vegetables, seeds, beans, and legumes into their daily routine. Sadly, however, without the kitchen tools and support, very few end up sticking with it. So, because adopting a plant-based diet transformed my life so profoundly, and because I want everybody to experience some version of what I've experienced, we decided to tackle and solve this very common problem. The solution we've devised, I'm proud to say, is the Plant Power Meal Planner, our affordable, all-in-one digital platform that sets you up for nutrition excellence by providing access to thousands of highly customizable, super delicious, and easy-to-prepare plant-based recipes. Everything integrates with automatic grocery delivery, and you get access to our amazing team of nutrition coaches 7 days a week and many other features. To learn more and to sign up, visit meals.richroll.com. And right now, for a limited time, we're offering $10 off an annual membership when you use the promo code RRHealth at checkout. This is life-changing stuff, people, for just $1.70 a week, literally the price of a cup of coffee. Again, that's meals.richroll.com, promo code RRHealth for $10 off an annual membership. All right, let's get back to the show. Well, what's interesting about all of this is understanding the incredible resilience of the human body. Like, it can be abused for extended periods of time. And when you course correct that, it's kind of amazing that the body is able to get back to some sort of homeostasis without a pharmaceutical intervention. The trick, of course, as you mentioned, is getting the medical establishment to truly grok this and make it part of what is recommended in their protocols. So what is your sense of where you're at with that right now? Like, do you have doctors who are on, I'm sure you do, that are prescribing this, that are on board with it? And what is the resistance or the obstacles that you still face? I mean, obviously the gold standard would be getting it to be reimbursed by insurance and, that kind of thing. I assume you're not quite there yet.
There are, I don't know, maybe 30 or 40,000 doctors around the world that are now recommending fasting mimicking diets. And I think they're all saying more clinical data, more FDA-style clinical data. And absolutely, right? So then we and others and most of the studies we're not doing, right? All universities are doing it on their own. We're just helping them. Right? So I think that everybody's waiting for more studies. They're coming. Lots of them are already finished and we're about to publish them. But I think, for cancer, Alzheimer, autoimmune diseases, et cetera, we're going to see more and more. But I think in addition to the FMD, I've been talking to lots of politicians, both in Italy and here, and I'm saying, imagine you have over 70% of people that are overweight or obese with all the chronic conditions that we discussed. And I said, imagine if you say, well, people are uneducated in a country, but I'm not going to have schools and I'm not going to have teachers, but I want everybody to be educated. It's never going to happen, right? Mm-hmm. You can say it as much as you want, right? Until you build the schools, until you have the teachers, it's not going to happen. So here we know that nutrition can revolutionize, almost everything in medicine. It's not going to cure everybody, but it can certainly make an incredible difference, more than we've ever seen, right? So certainly anything that is obesity related and overweight related. So, but we need to have the schools and we need to have the teachers, right? Mm-hmm. But these are going to be schools and teachers of nutrition and lifestyle. And I think that's by far the number one thing we're missing. Then I think, if you can get that, as we've shown it in a mouse study that we recently did, which you may have seen before, so we say, okay, forget it. It's never going to work. So let the mice eat lots of fat and lots of calories and become huge. And then once a month, we give them the FMD, the fasting mimicking diet, and we reverse everything, right? Mm. So I'm sort of going against that. I think people, should be followed and should be professional, so you don't get into very bad diet every day and then use the FMD to fix it. But I think that's the idea of the FMD. Maybe for those that are now willing to make daily changes, that's where you bring in the food as medicine.
Right. I mean, it's such a massive problem because every force that surrounds us is driving us towards that unhealthy choice. Everywhere we turn, all the marketing, the way the stores are configured, et cetera, you're almost bucking the trend in order to eat healthy and consider it an outlier. So education certainly is central to all of that, but there's also a social piece and a psychological piece. And as Dan Buettner talks about, creating infrastructure or environments that are conducive to the healthy choice. Because like smoking that has the label on it that says it's going to kill you, a lot of people just want to eat what they want to eat because it tastes good. And until they suffer from some kind of chronic ailment, they're really not going to look in the mirror and redress it.
Yes. And I think you probably even get closer, right? So you have to have like the teacher in the school, right? You have to show up at 8:00 and then you have to stay there until such a... So no, I don't mean that for people, but I mean, let's say, for example, once a month, you have a telemedicine call on the computer with your dietitian, your molecular biologist, and maybe once every 6 months with the physician. That's not very invasive, right? So, but now with all the apps and devices, you can monitor their weight from the distance. They wouldn't even have to tell you what they're weighing. You can monitor the blood pressure. You can monitor lots of different things. Now, pretty soon, the glucose level, you're going to be able to monitor without even, using a needle. So I think we're already at a point where, and that's what we're doing in Italy, by the way. We're starting this 500 people clinical trial with control, fasting mimicking diet, longevity diet, plus the fasting mimicking diet. So hopefully in about a year and a half, we'll have, solid data showing, I hope, success. But yeah, so it's not school 8 to 1. It's one telemedicine call once a month. And just to make sure that you're on track. Do you have any questions? For example, with the cancer trial, we see that when we do that, it's very successful, very high compliance. So we do a fasting mimicking diet and chemotherapy, et cetera, et cetera. The only trial when we didn't do that, we allow the clinics to just say, oh, here's a fasting mimicking diet, you take it home and do it. Then we went to 30% compliance, right? So most of the people could not comply for more, maybe 50% for 2 cycles of the fasting mimicking diet with chemotherapy, and then it dropped down, right? So it just told us that, and hopefully at some point it'd be also good to have a psychologist involved, as you mentioned, right? So this team of 4 people, I think physician, psychologist, molecular biologist, dietitian, it should be our schools and our teachers for lifestyle, and we don't have it.
Yeah. Well, I think that some of these new apps and technologies can really help with compliance as well. Like I started working with Inside Tracker and Levels, the continuous glucose monitor. And there's something about being able to pull the app up and look at where you're at in real time that makes it very, kind of maybe not urgent, but you're just connected to it in a way that's very different from going to your doctor once a year and getting your blood work done and seeing what it looks like on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
So how are you thinking about some of those technologies? Like, do you think there's a place for continuous glucose monitors with respect to kind of the avenues to which you're trying to push your patients or the people that you're working with?
Yeah, the technology, of course, is going to be central. But I think the human part, we cannot underestimate it, even if it happens by telemedicine, and the psychological part. So lots of things will have to be done, the old style. But yes, as new technology comes in, and it's the ones that we're talking about, whether it's the scale connected directly to the network or the continuous glucose monitor, et cetera, those are going to make everything easier. But I think that now we're starting to start a program in South Central for, you're a very highly educated lawyer, right? So most people are not as educated as you and I are. So I think that we need to also create a reality for people that may not have access to this world, this very high-tech world. And so, so we're starting a program in South Central. And there, I think we're going to, if it gets funded, we're going to try get into the houses, right? And try to convert slowly. Again, take a couple of years, maybe longer, right? And can we convert this family, the children, but also the parents, into this changed lifestyle? And I think it's going to take a lot of, I don't think we're just going to be able to say, oh, I send you an email with a application attached to it. I'll see you in a year. I think for the great majority of people in the world, for a number of years, we're still going to need to be present, and the physician is definitely too busy and not trained for any of this, by the way, right? So then, we need to have this team, and but the applications will certainly, and eventually artificial intelligence and the collection of, let's say, microbiota data, metabolomic data, et cetera. It's going to take a while, but at some point, you get maybe a drop of blood, and you'll be able to say, I don't know why, but you have a problem with iron intake. So Leroy Hood and other people are working on this, and so I think that but it's going to be maybe 5-10 years down the road, right? So now I think having 70% overweight group or obese group here and 50% overweight or obese in Europe. We need to act now, right? So and then once the technology comes, I think that even better.
Yeah, well, you can't solve the problem without understanding how to solve the problem in underserved communities like South Central, because that's really where the problem rests. And those communities are, they're not going on PubMed and reading research. There's going to have to be a completely different approach to try to figure out how to penetrate those communities and create real change.
Yeah, and that's the extreme, but I think there is a middle group, right, all over the United States that is not in that conditions, maybe as a lot of people in South Central, but it's still going to be much harder to penetrate than the Los Angeles or San Francisco or New York highly educated individual that follows everything we do, right? So I think the majority of people live in a very different world and than some of us, and I think that, but the majority of people will appreciate if you get a call from a dietitian and a psychologist or this team once a month. I think the majority of people will respond very well. And we certainly see it with the sick people, I mean, whether they have cancer or diabetes, that sort of feeling like we're following them and we're, okay, you got a problem, but here's the team. You got a team following you and helping you, So I think that psychologically, in addition to everything else, is essential.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I'm curious about, and this sort of came to me in the process of experimenting with a continuous glucose monitor, is that you get this real-time data after you eat, and you can see, the kind of curve in the graph of where your blood sugar is at postprandial. But I'm wondering, me as a consumer and not a scientist, I can look at that and I can draw conclusions from that, but I'm not sure those are the best conclusions, because what's happening postprandial, post-meal, is probably different from how it should be looked at from like a chronic perspective, right? So when you're thinking about or conceiving of what should go into the fasting mimicking diet or just a healthy diet in general on a daily basis, how do you think about what's happening biologically with each meal versus the chronic conditions that are the result of eating a certain way over a very long extended period of time?
Yeah, so we get all the time people, they may do something that is contained in the fasting mimicking diet and say my glucose spiked, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not really about, your glucose should spike if there is glucose or some form of carbohydrate in the diet. And in the fasting mimicking diet, we put the carbohydrates on purpose, right? It's a lot less than you will have in a normal diet, but it's still there. And it was designed on purpose to make sure that we don't have this yo-yo that I was talking about before. Why do I know that this yo-yo, let's say, we went much lower in carbohydrates. Let's say we went to 0 carbohydrate, 10%. I don't know that will hurt people to go back and forth like that, but I'm worried that it may, right? So, and I'm also worried that it might affect muscle. So now we have 3 clinical trials showing no muscle loss and increase in relative lean body mass. And that's very important. So now we believe that sugar, not sugar, but the little bit of carbohydrate we have in there, and even though they come with a little spike on fasting glucose, we believe that be protective of the muscle mass.
Mm-hmm.
And so now, eventually we're going to look at more lower glucose versions to see what happens both for compliance and for muscle mass, et cetera, et cetera. But right now, I think we feel pretty good about having all these great results from clinical trials that's irrelevant, right? And not just the fasting mimicking diet. It doesn't really matter, even in the everyday diet. You don't worry so much about your glucose monitor and whether there is a spike. Worry about the consequences on abdominal circumference, body fat, insulin resistance, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if your A1C, HbA1c is 6.5, you got a problem. If you have a spike in glucose and your A1C is 4.7, you're fine. It means that your glucose goes up, your body can process it. I wouldn't do 20 meals like that a day. I would stick with, let's say, 2 + 1 or 3 meals a day, and that's it. So you only have 3 opportunities for that to happen, and that's perfectly fine. And it's obviously not affecting your body in a negative way. So it's very important to, glycemic index, fine, but don't become obsessed with things that are part of a much more complicated network, including that may help you protect lean body mass. Right? So we now know that TOR can be affected. Well, we knew from our work in yeast, 30 years ago, but we knew that both sugars and amino acids can feed into TOR, and so now there's starting to be data looking at, let's say, leucine levels being essential for muscle building, but the glucose might also be pushing that the amino acids to perform more, right? So, these are still preliminary data, but certainly that's a possibility that if you go too low in sugars, the muscle might struggle in building as long as you're insulin sensitive.
Right. Let's go to protein for a minute. You mentioned earlier the idea that you've arrived at that lower protein before age 65 is optimal, and then after 65, it's important to increase your protein intake. So maybe walk me through how you arrived at that conclusion and what that means specifically for somebody who's listening or watching.
Yeah, so if you look at the mouse studies done, for the past 50 years, low protein is one of the ways that you can substitute calorie restriction to extend the life of a mouse. Then I think we did our study that I mentioned earlier, clearly showing that the low protein group had overall lower mortality, and the high protein group had a 400% increased risk for cancer mortality compared to the low protein. Now, keep in mind that low protein doesn't mean you're not eating protein. It means that you have to have the 0.35 grams per pound of body weight. So if you weigh 100 pounds, you should have at least 35, 40 grams of proteins. If you go below that, now you're starting to get into malnourishment. So it's low protein without malnourishment.
Right, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, about half of what the FDA would recommend. Isn't it 0.8 grams per kilogram?
Per kilogram. I was talking about pounds.
Okay.
Yeah, no. Yeah. So 0.8 is fine, right? So we're staying with the most the medical association. So the American Medical Association, I think, says about 0.8.
So that RDA, but in terms of like how most, at least Westerners, eat, that would be considered low protein, even though that's like kind of exactly what we're supposed to eat.
Yeah. So the average American will have maybe 50 to 100% more than that, right? Yeah, and so 0.8 is perfectly fine per kilogram, but then it should be mostly plant-based. And I think our study, all the Harvard study, the Giovannucci, Frank Hu, et cetera, they agree with that. And the Centenarian, the Okinawans had 9% calories from protein levels. The Southern Italians, certainly mostly plant-based. The Loma Linda people, low protein. So it's pretty clear. It's pretty consistent no matter where you look. And now the clinical data is also supportive of that potentially causing weight loss and the opposite of what everybody thinks. So having a low protein, the right carbohydrate diet can lead to weight loss instead of weight gain. And we'll have to wait and have bigger studies, but that's what it's looking like. We're going to see happening.
And is that related to a reduction in mTOR activation and IGF-1 levels, or what is it specifically about the protein biomechanically that's happening?
It looks like certain amino acids are controlling the fat cells, and they're controlling the hypothalamus, and they're really in charge of the decision to accumulate fat or break down fat. Right? So I was talking about before about the fasting mimicking diet. It looks like, and so we are actually now submitting a large grant to study that in the brain. it looks like the certain amino acids are at least in charge or maybe half of those effects, right? So telling the body, okay, now I'm going to start burning fat, or no, I'm going to get into a fat accumulation mode. So some of these switches are probably long lasting, right?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe epigenetic, may not be epigenetic. So epigenetic meaning that the DNA is getting modified. And so once it's modified, this could last a long, long time. But they're certainly long lasting. And this is why after the fasting mimicking diet, which of course is very low in protein, we see the leptin down for a long period in people, and we see the IGF-1 down for a long period. So, so we don't quite know the answer to your question, but I think it's looking like reprogramming. It's got a reprogramming effect on multiple systems.
And so what is happening around age 65 where that flips and it becomes more important to increase your protein intake?
Yeah. So if you look at the ENHANCE, which is the CDC database in the United States, and you look at the weight, right? So most people don't know this. Most people, or on average, people gain weight until 65, and then they start losing weight after 65. So it's something that we don't know what it is, right? But aging, of course, is at the very center of that. And there may be some key moment of the aging process where you are now getting into this rapid aging modality. And we know that because most of the deaths occur after 65. So after that, probably and this is also the Simpson group in Australia did this in mice. So after a certain age, it may be that the redundancy, so that the system needs more of the amino acids to do its minimal job. And if you start having a deficiency, you have a problem. And in our own study, we did it with mice. We took young mice and we gave them a very low protein diet. Nothing happened. We took old mice and we gave them the same very low protein diet. And within days, they started losing a lot of weight. So it's probably a matter of redundancy and maybe some of these growth factors are involved. And once you get below a certain threshold, you have a problem. And you may have a problem in the immune system, you may have problems with bones, with muscle, you may have a problem in the cognitive system. So I think it's just unsustainable for an older organism.
Well, it would seem that the more you're on top of these healthy practices as you inch towards 65 and after 65, the better position you're in to prevent those sort of declines being as rapid as they would otherwise. So if you're maintaining your muscle mass with resistance training, if you're eating appropriately in accordance with your protocols and the sort of blue zones criteria, and you're engaged in your community and you have purpose in your life, that a lot of that, like extension or prolonging of longevity, is really about the robustness that you enter that stage of life with, so that it doesn't hit you like a ton of bricks and you kind of become decrepit in an expedited way.
It's an equilibrium of robustness, right? Because you, on one side, you could be feeding your muscle with IGF-1, and there's no doubt about it. And on one side, you could be feeding the cancer cell with IGF-1. And so as you enter that stage...
But if you're doing the plant-based protein...
Well, if you're doing the plant-based protein, then
you increase your
you're going to become frail intake, as most of the Southern Europeans, right? The Italians. Actually, the Italians...
Don't tell me that, Valter.
So we cannot mix the doing it right with doing it, right? Mm-hmm. So the Southern Italians are actually twice as frail as the Northern Europeans, right? Or the Italians are twice as frail.
At a certain stage in life or later in life, they become more frail.
Yeah, they're long-lived, but frail. That doesn't mean that you cannot be vegan or pescatarian and be very strong. Just there is and that's what we've been working both in Italy and here very hard with mice. We said, what is the nutrition, the age-specific nutrition that prevents a frailty to the bones, to the muscle, the immune system, but at the same time does not affect the longevity extension, right? Mm-hmm. It's very tricky.
There's a sweet spot in between those two polarities.
And there is an age-dependent sweet spot. That's why we're saying now don't go from low protein to high protein. Go from low protein to moderate, maintain the plant-based, but start introducing more, let's say, vegetarian if you don't want to have meat component, a vegetarian component, more eggs, more cheeses, et cetera, et cetera. Now, of course, you can do it without any of this. You can do it with the seeds, the nuts, right? So you could be 100% vegan and do it. It's just a little bit more of a job to do it while staying vegan, but that's perfectly fine.
Right, but when you're 100, what else do you have to do?
Yeah.
You could divert some of that energy towards being focused on that.
It's not just energy. You gotta have the people some people that know what they're doing, right? So, for example, the legumes are very low in leucine, methionine, et cetera, but the seeds are not, and the nuts are not, right? So, yeah, you need to pay attention and have somebody help you, guide you through it, because otherwise you can become osteoporotic and not realizing it at all until you have a fracture, and then you're in trouble.
Yeah. I had a guy in here who is 100, and he broke all these marathon records when he was 90 and 91, and just an amazing guy. But he went plant-based at 70 in response to a colon cancer diagnosis, and has been plant-based for 30 years. And at age 100, he's as passionate about it as ever. And he still is running and training and doing all of these things. And so when you're saying that, like, I understand everything you're saying, and I see this living example of a guy who appears to be doing it correctly and was telling me he's having the most fun he's ever had in his life. So it's crazy.
I mean, keep in mind, a lot of people that are vegan eat a lot of proteins, right? So a lot of vegan proteins.
I'm sure he's eating a lot more protein.
Yeah. So if you eat a lot of protein, let's say 25% of your, and this is very common among vegans. And so, for example, I think Luigi Fontana did a study where he was looking at the vegans, and their IGF-1 was actually pretty high, right? Because they were high protein. They had such a high protein diet.
So even if you're eating a ton of plant-based protein, you can still drive up IGF-1.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Because we're talking about 10% and below in our study, right? 10% of the calories or less had to come from proteins to be in the low protein group. So if you're now 25% of your calories coming from protein, you're most likely are going to be in the high risk. And in fact, in our study, we did the people that had mostly plant-based, instead of a 4-fold increase in cancer risk, they had a 3-fold increase in cancer mortality risk. So it changed better, but went from 400% to 300% increase risk of cancer mortality.
Prophets walk among us. As a writer and podcaster for nearly 10 years, I've become more convinced than ever that our world is populated by scores of beautiful and brilliant people who have amazing stories to share. Those that we don't know, who can teach us something new and leave us all the better for the experience of their sharing. And so I've dedicated my career to tracking down the most compelling prophets on the planet, going deep with each of them on my podcast to elucidate the best of what they have to offer and to sharing the insights gleaned for the benefit of all. But the podcast is not the only medium by which to share their stories, which is why I'm proud to announce the release of my new book, Voicing Change Volume 2. More than mere words on paper, Voicing Change is a physical manifestation of the magic, inspiration, and timeless wisdom that transpires each week on the Rich Roll podcast. The first edition of Voicing Change was a beautifully rendered book worthy of display on any coffee table. And Volume 2 follows in that tradition by showcasing even more of my favorite conversations in an elegant publication replete with interview excerpts, essays, and stunning photography, making for an exquisite companion to the first volume or a satisfying standalone work. Picking up this book allows you to revisit the wisdom of your favorite everyday prophets and physically interact with the life-changing ideas contained within. Voicing Change Volume 2, available now while supplies last for a limited time. Order your copy today only at richroll.com. I'm interested in your thoughts on another, like the other side of the coin with respect to health span science and longevity, because a lot of the press is oriented around the sexiness of things like rapamycin and metformin and sirtuins and the like, which is very different than the kind of longevity science that you're interested in and focused on. So how are you thinking about what's going on in that kind of related field with respect to looking towards extending health span?
Yes. So first of all, I come from that world, right? So I come from the world. We were testing rapamycin in yeast, and I think we got it from Mike Hall back in 1995 or that. So we were probably the first lab in the world that was working on rapamycin and longevity. And my lab discovered the role of the TOR pathway in aging in 2001. So we're very much, supportive of the understanding of what genes and what drugs that affect genes do. But I think that for the next 10, 20 years, maybe 30 years, reality is that we have 3 billion years of what I call 3 billion years of R&D, right? So our body has been developing for 3 billion years if you think about the origin of species. And so you could say, I'm going to biohack my way through it, right? So I have this incredibly sophisticated system, and I'm going to intervene with a drug that blocks TOR. But TOR does so many things, right? And guess what? If you block TOR in people with rapamycin, they become hyperglycemic, right? And mice become hyperglycemic. So it's just very clear evidence that it's not as straightforward as
all these downstream. You have to look at it holistically and understand there's a bazillion intervening variables, and it's all very complicated.
It's very complicated, and you have no data, right? So who knows what happens after 40 years of rapamycin or metformin?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, metformin's got more data, right? So in support of what Nir Barzilai is trying to do, metformin's got a lot more data. But even metformin, what happens if you give it to somebody that's perfectly healthy? Well, we don't know, and I think that that's going to be an issue. And also, but if you look at statistics or if you do some calculations, the easiest success is going to come from something that is already existing for that purpose. So if you are a yeast, and I already know that I can switch you into a modality where you live 5 times or 10 times longer because you've evolved that modality to sustain moments where you don't have enough to reproduce, then that's by far the safest, right? Because it's there for a purpose. So then the question is there a human alternative modality that is much longer lived? And everything points to yes, right? So otherwise, we wouldn't see these little people in Ecuador not getting any disease. We have one guy that we just interviewed, and he's 80 years old, and he's been drinking and smoking every day of his life. And everybody else does not have a disease. But we thought, this guy is no way. And sure enough, never had any chronic condition. And is drunk all the time, smoking all the time. So having the mouse data and having the human data now and all the other organisms, we know that there is an alternative mode. So if you're going to intervene with drugs, my opinion is that intervene in the master regulator. Don't intervene downstream, right? So intervene very high up, let's say the level of growth hormone, releasing hormone, growth hormone, et cetera, because that's more likely to not interfere with anything intracellularly and not come up with as many problems as solutions.
Right. So I assume that would be the same perspective with respect to supplementation when we're, you hear about NR and NAD and all all of these kind of protocols that people are adopting in the kind of biohacking world. Do you see any efficacy or validity in playing around with that, or what do you think?
Playing around with the research, yes, right. But I think that when you have, this is why we go multi-pillar, right? So, so you have to have the epidemiological studies, the clinical studies, the centenarians. Many centenarians have been taking this for 7 or 80 years. And what is the research on all these different organisms saying? So I think the closest you get to 4 or 5 pillars supporting it, and the more you can think about it, but it's hard to imagine, right? Any of this having that kind of support thus far. So yes, you could say, I see, take the 16 hours of fasting, right? There's no doubt that there's very beneficial. But then you got to wait 30 or 40 years, and then you get the meta-analysis, and people that skip breakfast have a problem. So you would never have known that until you get to that point. That the famous, those famous studies of all studies So then the question is, for all these supplements and interventions, where is the data competing, let's say, with what we already know can get you to 100 to 110 now? So I think now we're starting, if you look at the study in Norway, the life expectancy increase, if you started just what it's about a third of what I described in the longevity diet, it was associated, if you started at 20, with 11 to 13 years of life expectancy increase. If you started at 60, it was associated with 8 to 9 years of life expectancy increase, right? So now you had the fasting mimicking diet at 12 hours a day, 3 times as much. Now you're thinking 15, 20 years, not thinking. The data will suggest maybe 15 to 20 years of life expectancy increase. So you introduce a supplement. What if that decrease your lifespan by 20 years after you take it for 30 years? That's what
we don't know yet.
Yeah, you have to make sure that you don't. We're not in Las Vegas, and this is people's lives, right? So you want to take a chance like that on your life. Much better to go with what we know than what we think is going to happen.
My sense from looking at your work is that what's good for longevity also appears to be good for cancer risk reduction. Is there a point at which those two diverge? Because you are focused in these two worlds. So what's similar about them seems to be a lot, but is there anything dissimilar or something that somebody who is suffering from cancer or concerned about that should be doing a little bit differently from somebody who's purely focused on longevity?
The only thing, the only concern is, of course, the frailty and the cachexia, et cetera, when you are a cancer patient, right? So, and this is a big fight we have in every clinical trial in many places around the world. So the physicians will say, I'm not going to allow you to put this extreme vegan or close to vegan diet in between fasting mimicking diet cycles. And we fight, to get it in there because we're saying, treat cancer first and get the cancer. And then if the patient is losing some muscle mass, that's okay compared to, let's say, a very rapidly advancing cancer. So yeah, but it's a legitimate concern. And so we've been collaborating with Alessandro Laviano at the University of Rome, who's an expert in this, and trying to, get to the point. And in fact, in the clinical trial that we published last year, we were successful in doing that. So the women that had breast cancer and received hormone therapy with the fasting mimicking diet, we dosed the in-between diet in a way that it allowed them to maintain a very good lean body mass, so muscle mass.
Yeah, I noticed on your website you have different kind of protocols or marching orders for different types of people with respect to FMD. So you have protocols for people who are undergoing chemotherapy or about to undergo chemotherapy, for pregnant women, for adolescents, et cetera. So how do those protocols like shift and morph depending upon your stage of life or whatever it is that you're kind of going through?
Yeah, I'm not sure which website you're referring to.
I can't remember. Maybe it was the other one.
Yeah, obviously for diseases, we tell people, talk to your physician, right? And together with your physician, decide whether, this should be applied. And then, in most cases, we like to have a clinical trial rather than improvisation. But yeah, it's a discussion with your physician. And then, for everybody else, again, different people, different situations. Some people are going to need a dietitian to work with. Some people are going to need a physician to work with. Some people don't need anybody if it's just trying to lose some weight and maybe again a little bit of reset. But I think that, as I was saying earlier, the team is not there. Maybe it's not all necessary, but certainly a dietitian that knows what they're doing should be consulted before starting. So we do this at the foundation. It's a nonprofit clinic in Santa Monica, and we have one in Italy. And so we'd be happy to help anybody that, even those that cannot pay at all. So we have a program for those that cannot afford even the visit. Right. So I think it's good to figure out what you need. Right. So yeah.
Is there what is the ideal period of life to begin this process? Like if you're a teenager, can you see benefits doing an FMD? Like what is your sense of what the science says in terms of younger people?
Yeah, well, so we started a clinical trial at Gaslini Children's Hospital for type 1 diabetics at age 10 to 18. And we've been talking to CHLA, Children's Hospital Los Angeles, about one for obesity and overweight control. So we don't know, and this should only be tested as a clinical trial. In fact, in Gaslini Hospital, they're going to be inpatient, right? So nobody wanted to take a chance with the children and allow them to do it outside. But yeah, I think that it may turn out, and I don't know, but we'll test it. We'll test it for the possibility that these 5 days of a vegan diet will allow a physical improvement in the child, but also a psychological improvement, right? So it's an exposure to 5 days of a vegan diet with certain characteristics, which may be very different from what they eat all the time at school and at home. And so that's our hope, is able to reprogram the child psychologically and physically so that they eat better. We clearly see this in adults, right? So that, some of the effect, the IGF-1, et cetera, is not psychological, but some of the effect we think is psychological, meaning that many of the adults are changing their relationship with food, and they don't feel, they're not appreciating some of the bad food as much as they did before. Because now I think that, in science, we have something called food aversion. So some foods are associated with problems and you stay away from it because they cause some other problems. But there may be also, probably there is also the opposite of food aversion. You feel so good with this vegan 5 days, fasting mimicking diet, that your brain might be telling you, let's move in that direction because I don't know why, but I felt better in those 5 days, right? And maybe in the few days following. So, so I think that the child, my speculation is that the best moment to do it would probably be, let's say, in a teenager, because that could really change your life, right? So we know that, I wrote a book about children and longevity, and we know that if you're overweight continuously from age 7 to age 18, you have a fourfold increase in the risk of developing diabetes. So intervening at that age could have even a bigger impact than
as you're forming those dietary habits that will become more calcified with age.
Habits, but also potentially epigenetic changes, right? So we know that, for example, you can do a methionine restriction or a protein restriction in a mouse early in life and stop, and they live longer. It's really remarkable, right? So,
is there a connection to the microbiome with that? I would assume there is some gut microbiome changes that take place that take root.
It could be affected by the microbiome, but it could be the entire, the brain and maybe cells in the brain and the adipocytes, the fat cells. Everything is now reprogrammed into, okay, let's accumulate fat for potentially the rest of our lives. And this is why some people, we see people that have been, say, overweight for 20, 30 years. And you were asking earlier, right? It takes a long effort to convert them. Right? So their brain is completely set into, I have to get back to that weight because probably, it makes sense, right? So if you've been okay for 20 or 30 years at a certain weight, even though that is overweight, your brain is trying to bring you back because it knows that you're stable at that weight. And so trying to move it to another weight, it's a challenge. And so, so the child potentially could be condemned for the rest of its life, of his or her life, to be at this overweight status, which evolution set to protect them and not to hurt them.
Right, and there's something metabolically that happens that creates like a set point that becomes very difficult to permanently alter. Like you can go on a diet, you can gain weight, you can lose weight, but ultimately you're going to always settle back to that one place.
Yes, and that's what I was saying. That's probably like this steady state that your brain recognizes as safe.
Right.
Because everything was working when you were there, right? Your reproductive system and everything else was working. So I know if I get you back there, let's say that you were 140 pounds, a woman that is overweight, 140 pounds. And the system, if you've been there for 25 years, the system knows that you're doing okay at 140 pounds. And so it wants you get back there also because of what we were saying earlier. Of course, it wants the reserves to be there. The fat accumulation is part of survival, right? So you used to die if in those 2 months of no food, you did not have that extra, 10 pounds or 20 pounds of fat. So there is more than you were healthy at 140. There is also, I don't want to take any chances. Let's keep that fat. So we stigmatize, right? Obesity, and yet obesity and even diabetes potentially is part of our survival mechanisms, right? So that's why it's so important to, instead of, now we're talking about, you can now say every weight is good for you. I think we need to move into, first of all, don't stigmatize it because it's part of who we are and part of what the emperor penguins and so many animals have an obesity state periodically, right? So it's perfectly fine to be obese, but it's not perfectly healthy to be obese all the time. And in fact, it's better to be at a normal weight all the time. So, instead of stigmatizing, let's remove that, but let's also try to help people make it to a weight where they can be happier and healthier.
Is there a sense of the mechanism that's creating that set point? Because if you could really understand that, perhaps you could figure out a way of changing it. So metabolically, you create a new sort of, steady state for that individual that would be healthier than whatever it is that they're currently settled on.
Yeah, I think we're getting pretty close with the molecular mechanism, right? So for example, in mice, when we take the mice on a high-fat, high-calorie diet, and then we give them the FMD, the fasting mimicking diet, and you see, and then we look later, 4 days later and 15 days later, they're still breaking down fat, right? So, and leptin is down, and so the whole system is now being rewired. Now, I think it's just a matter of details, but we have a pretty good handle on what controls these different states, either put fat away or break it down. And it makes sense, right? You enter the winter state, and at some point, you fast for long enough, and that's your switch, right? And so it's a switch, start breaking it down and continue to break it down. But then, as I was saying earlier, you fast for too long, and now it's your thrifty mode. So now your system says, okay, now I'm going to starve if I keep using fat at this level. So I'm going to slow down my metabolism, and I'm going to try to burn the fat more slowly. And that's why you need to have the science to get you, do the fasting mimicking diet, but don't go too long. Don't go too short because you don't enter this catabolic mode. Don't go too long because now you're going to enter the thrifty mode. And so
you have to thread the needle.
You have to convert the switch and then allow it to be in the high metabolic fat burning mode. And for example, that carbohydrates that we include in the fasting mimicking diet, they could also be helping that, right? We don't know all the details of the molecular switches, but it could be that one of them is very low carbohydrate, zero carbohydrate. This could be one of the triggers of thrifty mode. Okay, so now I am going into a very low metabolic mode because I don't want to risk running out of fuel.
What is the role of exercise in all of this? It would seem that if you're vigorously exercising, obviously you're going to eat more food. I don't know what the relationship between exercise is and metabolic health, but when you're burning more calories, maybe that changes the way that your body is dealing with all of this. Like, how does that all play into longevity?
Yeah, so it shouldn't be about calorie levels. It should be about the results of that, right? So if you're losing muscle mass, and then you probably need to eat more. So there is not a set level of calories that you take on, and you probably should eat more proteins. So different people, different sports, different training regimen, different nutrition. And of course, you need to try to stay as close as possible to the longevity diet. But for some people, that might be too extreme to maintain whatever muscle mass or the ability to train that they have, and so they have to, tweak it so that you can do what you think is so important to you, and so get the longevity benefits and don't compromise what's essential for your sport.
Well, I guess I'm thinking more in the context of how exercise fits into longevity more broadly, because when you look at the Blue Zones communities, these people are not going to the gym and doing anything that's all that extreme. They're just living kind of consistently engaged, active lifestyles. When you look at the way we think about exercise in the Western world, it is, going to the gym, putting muscle mass on, or it's being an endurance athlete and going out and doing very long stuff. It seems that there would be sort of a middle ground where this is helpful in terms of life extension, but past a certain point, you're harming yourself or you're undermining your body's ability to persist.
Yes. So as I was saying earlier, lots of people in the Blue Zones are frail. Mm-hmm. It's okay. I mean, it doesn't kill you because they live long, right? So, but they're frail. So, and some of the people that might have record longevity probably have genetic predisposition to it. It's pretty clear. I took a lot of trips in Italy and interviewing hundreds of centenarians, and I hear a lot. My sister made it to 95, and my brother made it to 92. And when you see that, there's a big genetic component. But the
Except
lifestyle,
with Loma Linda, maybe. That seems to be a unique case study.
But Loma Linda does not have many centenarians, right? Loma Linda has longevity extension, worker Gary Fraser and others, but not necessarily lots of centenarians. So I think that when you look at the meta-analysis for exercise, 150 minutes of exercise per week seem to be ideal. As you go to 300 minutes, you don't get any benefits. So now you want to probably keep to around 150. And learning from the Blue Zone and the centenarians, I would say an hour of walking a day, maybe a couple hours of walking during the weekend. That seems to be a good compromise. And also weight training. Yes, they didn't do it, but again, I see them all the time. They're pretty frail. Of course, they were not frail as when they were working in the field and doing manual labor. But when they stop, then they become very frail. So I think that's why it's so important to keep the weight training, very light. For example, in a cancer patient, we have a video now we utilize, and there was 20 minutes a day of a very light muscle exercise, right? So just enough protein, light muscle exercise training, and then 150 minutes a week, which is not that much. And then 1 hour a day of walking and maybe a couple hours during the weekend. That seems to be pretty solid no matter how you look at it, whether the centenarians and the Blue Zone people were right or whether the meta-analyses are correct. But I think that's why you want to get the common denominator. Let's just get in the middle of all of it. And does this violate anybody's rule? No, it doesn't. So I don't think a centenarian will say 150 minutes of a little bit more of strenuous exercise is going to hurt you. And again, lots of them, like the shepherds, they used to do 5, 10, 15 miles a day going up and down the hills, right? They might not be exercise the way we view it, but pretty close, right?
Yeah.
Pretty close.
Yeah.
And even the women that stayed home in Seulo, Villa Grande Strisaili, when we interviewed them, they say, my husband used to go, and walk with the sheep, but I would be in the field as I was a farmer, and that's a lot of energy that goes into farming. So I would say they probably did a good portion of exercise like activities.
So walk me through your daily routine with food and exercise. What do you do in practice?
Yeah, so I do, in breakfast, I have this almond, almost 100% almond and cocoa spread, very low sugar. And then I have, it's called a frisella. I get them both from southern Italy. It's a whole grain toast, but it's very particular, right? And then I, in the United States, in the 6 months that I'm in the US, my lunch is and then I have an apple and tea.
Mm-hmm.
That's my breakfast every
No
morning.
coffee.
No coffee. Coffee is my lunch, right? So
Okay.
that's all I have for lunch is coffee. In the United States, in Italy, I can't skip lunch. So I have lunch also in Italy, and then if my weight is under control, then at 5 I will have another frisella and maybe another fruit. If my weight tends up, then I skip the snack at 5 p.m. And then my typical dinner would be, let's say, about 70 grams of pasta, about 350 grams of legumes, beans, chickpeas, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
And then about 300 grams of mixed vegetables, like green beans, et cetera. So a pretty big dish, lots of olive oil, and usually like a little piece of bread. So of course, then I have fish maybe 2 times a week, and that's about it.
So that would break down, it feels like somewhere around 70% carbohydrate, 20%
no, maybe
fat, 10% protein.
Yeah, maybe 50-60% carbohydrate because lots of nuts, olive oil.
Yeah.
So those are, of course, more calories per gram. So I would say probably about 60-30, 10 to 13, 14% proteins. Yeah.
And when you're in Italy, more pasta?
More
big, long lunches?
But lunch
more wine.
is added. And of course, and then I gain weight a little bit, not very much, but I gain weight by doing this 3+1, 3 meals plus a snack. And so now we're going to test that. My lifestyle on 500 people. Let's randomize. Let's see what happens. But
and all your blood markers are good and fine. I'm sure you're
no drugs.
Yeah.
And of course, I come from a family of hypertension and all kinds of problems. So thus far, I've never taken a drug. Everything is in place. Yeah.
And how old are you now?
54.
54. Not a gray hair on your head.
No, I have
a little bit.
But
and how often do you do the FMD then for yourself?
I do the FMD maybe a couple of times a year, but I'm pretty strict with the rest, right? So I think that in the trials we see that. I mean, the ones that are like the examples of health, they're not benefiting, at least acutely, as much as the normal people, let's say, right? So I think that I'm already probably because of the longevity diet every day and the 12 hours. I do that. So I do 12 to 13 hours of fasting per day. So I think, and then the lunch skipping. So I have a double sort of daily fast, right? So I do the nightly fast, but I also do at least a partial daily fast. So I think that probably twice a year is good enough.
Yeah. You mentioned that you have a study coming out soon. I mean, where is your focus clinically at the moment? And what are you looking to kind of explore in terms of your research?
The moving it to standard of care is my ambition for anything that is cardiometabolic, right? So diabetes, prediabetes, metabolic syndrome. I think we're getting very close to, have the conclusive studies. And this is not going to be conclusive, but it's certainly these 3 or 4 that we're publishing now are going to move in that direction where I think most people say, okay, I believe this. And then we're going to need, in some cases, talking to the FDA. In some cases, maybe not. Maybe have programs that are more lifestyle-centered in support of the standard of care. But I think the FDA is now starting to appreciate more that they have to allow this lifestyle intervention to go after the diseases because of the obvious very bad state we're in, with almost 20% of the GDP going to healthcare. So, cardiometabolic and then slowly moving, metabolic and then slowly moving to cardiac, prevention and potentially treatment. And then, of course, cancer. So lots of trials going on for cancer. And we're excited now. We just went to the FDA, filed an IND, and now we got sort of the okay to proceed with the FDA process for a food as a drug for hormone therapy. So in combination with a hormone therapy for women with breast cancer. So that's great because we thought maybe the FDA is going to be opposed to this, but I think they seem to be very supportive, and
that's cool.
So that's good news. And then I think the more the merrier. I encourage every university that wants to do studies. We'll help them. We'll give them the FMD, and they can tell us the results, right? I'm very enthusiastic about Alzheimer because, of course, of the brain rewiring that occurs during. Now we have data from mice, but let's say that this is really changing the way the brain functions for 5 days, and so we like this idea that maybe that's what's needed for Alzheimer's. So many drugs have failed, and so maybe a complete reset of the brain in some ways that it may help. It's not going to be a miracle, but certainly if it helps people. People don't realize if we postpone aging by 5 years, we will cut Alzheimer's cases by half or so, right?
Yeah,
so all we need to get rid of almost half of Alzheimer's cases is to slow down the aging process 5 years. That's why I think that Del Bredesen and others now are talking about the ability to detect 20, 30 years before. So now if you're 50 and you can tell that 80 you're going to have Alzheimer, then that's a great time to switch to longevity diet plus FMD. And I'd be shocked if we don't give you the extra 5 years. But as I mentioned earlier, now we have data, not just our own, looking at 15 to 20 years of life expectancy. So I think that's some of the enthusiasm for what we do.
Yeah. Well, I think with the advent of scanning technology and the ability to early detect some of these things is going to be a huge thing as well. Because if you know early on this is where you're headed, and you have these tools that you're developing at the consumer's disposal to deploy to prevent them from getting that, it's massive.
Yes, and especially now, because I think that a lot of physicians were trained in this world, whether it was cardiovascular disease or diabetes or Alzheimer, there's nothing you can do about it. That's it. You're stuck with diabetes, which is shocking that anybody will say that. But that's that's been the story for a long, long time. Now I think everybody, including the physicians, are starting to say, well, maybe not, right? Maybe now we can do something about it. That's when then you want to know. You want to know that you're insulin resistant, or you want to know that your calcium score is very high and you are at risk of having a heart attack, et cetera, et cetera. So because now you have interventions, especially nutritional, that can revolutionize or certainly have a big effect on the risk. And so, good to know.
It's massively important. Heart disease being America's #1 killer, the explosion of rates of type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer rates also escalating alarmingly. This is where our focus needs to be at dealing with. These are the three big conditions that are plaguing the most people.
Yeah, and don't forget that diabetes almost doubles the chance of Alzheimer, right? So we already know that a big factor in Alzheimer is the metabolic dysfunction. So if it doubles that, now if you can intervene, and now you have 72% of people overweight or obese, and 10% of the population being diabetic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, that's just shocking. Shocking. There is not a government-centered big effort. And we're now presenting some of the calculations. How much you will save if you had the team that I'm talking about. You will spend every dollar you spend, you get 10 back, or 5 to 10 back. But then you get it back just with the diabetes. That's an incredible thing, right? So if for every dollar you spend in this team of dietitian, molecular biologists, physician, psychologists, you get 5 back just for diabetes. Then the rest of it is bonus: the Alzheimer, the cardiovascular disease, the cancer, right? So it's just, I don't have an explanation other than the unconspired conspiracy. There's just too many people that are making money the way it is, and nobody wants to change it. And so the media is confusing the hell out of everybody, and people, they say, I don't know what to do every day. Low carb, high protein, low protein. Now they're going to listen to me and say, oh, low protein now. This is a new thing. So yeah, that's we're moving away from facts and moving into fashion. And this is very convenient for people that are making lots of money the way the system is, because then if it's confused, you don't change it, right?
Right. Yeah. From the tobacco industry, confusion is our product. As long as consumers are confused, they'll continue to purchase our thing and remain in the dark.
And this is much harder because now food, I just mentioned pasta, bread, So if you eat the right amount, it's perfectly fine. And when you go to an excess, if you have, like in Italy, everybody was blaming sugary drinks for the overweight. So the Italians are now at the same level of overweight as the Americans. And everybody was blaming junk food and the sugary drinks. When we looked at it, it turned out that it was pasta,
size.
bread, potatoes, fruit juices. They had 1 pound a day of this, right? But yet everybody was blaming something else, right? So I think that it's much harder to fight because most of these things are perfectly fine for you until you have 1 pound a day or 2 pounds a day of it, right? So now it becomes a problem. So then the company that sells bread or pasta or potatoes say, you're crazy. There's nothing wrong with potatoes. I agree. But once you now have 10% extra every day, that's all you need. Not even 2%, right?
Yeah.
An extra 50 calories a day. And if you look at the last 40 years, that's all that has increased, calorie intake. It's not about protein. When we had the low-fat period, people gain weight. We had the low-carb period, people gain weight. So, but we now have hundreds of calories more than 50 years ago that we take in per day, and that's what does the trick. And of course, the composition also matters, right? So if you have, the red meat, et cetera, now we know that, as I just mentioned from this meta-analysis, so it's not just about the calories, but certainly the calories are a good place to start.
I do think the pasta in Italy is different, though. When you eat it there, I feel fine after eating it there, whereas when I eat it here, I feel lethargic and tired after eating it. I don't know if the flour is different or what's going on. Like, you have a sense of that? Or is it just I have a romantic, I'm having a romantic experience being in Italy and
now I'm going to make the Minister of Agriculture very happy by saying, buy Italian pasta, Yeah. It's available in the United States. And so we didn't set up to advertise for anybody, but maybe, right? It's possible that there are, certainly different pastas and made different ways and with different gluten levels, with different grains. And I think the best one is probably the one that with the whole grains.
Sure.
The much lower gluten. That's what we used to use back in the days, maybe 70 or 80 years ago. And those are probably preferable. But most of the pastas out there are high gluten, and they're not using this old grains.
Not anymore. Well, I think a good way to kind of end this is with a few thoughts for the person who's new to all of this and is thinking, "Wow, this is some great information. I'm excited about this. I want to try an FMD. I should get my blood work done, figure out where I'm at." Like, what is like a good on-ramp for the uninitiated to begin to start thinking about food, diet, lifestyle, longevity?
Probably get my book. It's all, I don't make a penny out of it. It's all going to the...
you give all the money to
100% of the funds go to charity or to the foundation. And I think the book is pretty... extensively explaining everything we talked about. I don't think I have anything that I would like to change other than maybe emphasize more the personalization. I don't think I did a good enough job in the original book talking about, if you're gluten sensitive, if you're sensitive to tomatoes or you're sensitive to something, you probably need to avoid some of these things and find an alternate. And next year I'm going to come up with I published it in Italy, and now it's coming, the cancer book, so all that we do focus on cancer, and now nutrition can make a big impact in fasting and mimicking diets, but also nutrition make a big impact on on cancer patients, both prevention and treatment. So that's coming maybe about a year from now. Yeah.
Mm. Well, I think you're performing an unbelievable service at a great time of need in terms of health. So I applaud you. I'm at your service. I appreciate the work that you do. And I'm excited to see where this science takes us. I think it feels like we're on the precipice of some pretty amazing breakthroughs as the convergence of all these different research modalities and technologies become more robust and widely available. I think we're going to see some really cool stuff happening.
Yes, yes. And thank you for doing an amazing job on your side. I think the information, we could do all the work in the world, and if it doesn't get out there explained correctly, it's like Pirandello used to say, it's like it never existed. You know?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. So pick up Valter's book, The Longevity Diet. And if they want to learn more about you, your website, valterlongo.com, or where should they go?
I think the foundation, Create Cures Foundation, and again, therethere's a createcures.org. There's a clinic that you can visit. So createcures.org is probably the best information. Facebook also, Professor Valter Longo, English site. We have lots of articles that we publish on everybody, not just what we do.
Yeah, cool. And enjoy Italy.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. You go 6 months, 6 months.
6 months in Italy now, a rough 6 months of Italian summer.
Yeah. I'm jealous, my friend. Well, I appreciate talking to you always. You're always welcome here, and enjoy your summer and stay in touch.
Thanks, Rich.
Sure. Peace. Bye.